"School is closed, Miss Whitmore." The words were written on a paper nailed crooked to the front door, where every child in town could see them before Clara reached the bottom step. The bell rope hung still above her shoulder. Her key no longer turned in the lock. Her small trunk sat beside the porch rail because Mrs. Larkin had left it there before breakfast, tied with cord and covered against dust, as if kindness could make eviction quieter. Clara stood with her gloved hands folded around the handle of her sewing basket and read the notice once more, not because the words had changed, but because her body had not yet decided what to do with them. The schoolhouse had been her room, her work, her table, and for 6 years the place where people sent their children when they wanted them minded, lettered, and kept from trouble until supper. Now the town had voted to combine lessons with the church school 3 miles south, where the minister's niece had already been promised the post. No one had told Clara before the paper went up. They had thanked her in passing for years. They had trusted her with fevers, sums, spelling books, torn sleeves, and boys who would not sit still. But when the school closed, no one remembered that she slept in the narrow room behind it. A wagon rolled by on the street, slow in the morning mud. 2 women on the boardwalk looked over, then looked away with the practiced mercy of people who did not intend to help. Clara lifted the trunk by one end and dragged it down 1 step. The wood scraped hard enough to make her stop. She set it down gently after that. Not everything worn should be made to suffer more. Across the road, Ethan Cole stood beside the hitching rail with a sack of feed over one shoulder and his nephew Ben at his side. Ethan did not move at first. He only watched the school door, the trunk, the basket, and the way Clara stood as if holding herself together was one more chore to finish before noon. Ben saw it faster than any adult in the street. He saw that she did not look toward the boarding house. He saw that she did not look toward the church. He saw her hand go once to the pocket where she kept her rent money, then fall away empty. "Uncle Ethan," he said quietly. Ethan lowered the feed sack into the wagon bed. He did not ask questions across the street. He did not call attention to her. He walked over, took off his hat, and stopped at the bottom step. Clara looked down at him with the notice behind her and the whole town pretending not to watch. Ethan reached for the trunk, but he did not touch it until she gave the smallest nod. Then he lifted it as if it weighed less than shame ought to. Ben came after him carrying the sewing basket with both hands, careful of the worn lid and the blue thread caught under its latch. Clara noticed that. She noticed because nobody ever carried her things as if they mattered. At Ethan's wagon, a tin coffee cup sat near the seat, still warm from his morning. He moved it aside and made space for her trunk. Then, after a moment, he set the cup back where she could reach it. "Road is muddy," he said. "You can ride as far as town." Clara looked at the cup, the wagon, the boy holding her basket like a promise he did not yet understand. She had nowhere fixed to go. Ethan knew it. Ben knew it. The town nearly knew it and was ashamed of knowing. Clara stepped down from the schoolhouse porch, closed the gate behind her, and heard the latch fall with a sound too small for the end of a life. The wagon did not take Clara to the boarding house. It stopped there first, because Ethan was a man who did things in the proper order, and because charity given too quickly could feel too much like being handled. Mrs. Dobbins came to the door wiping flour from her hands. She looked at Clara, then at the trunk in the wagon bed, then at Ethan. "Full up," she said, though 2 upstairs windows stood open to air empty rooms. Clara reached for her basket before anyone could see her fingers tighten. Ethan only nodded once. He drove on. At the mercantile, he stepped down for nails and lamp oil. Ben stayed on the wagon seat beside Clara, holding the sewing basket in his lap as carefully as a sleeping cat. The tin coffee cup rested between them, the last heat gone from it now, but Clara had not moved it away. "You taught me fractions with apple slices," Ben said. Clara looked at him. He kept his eyes on the team. "I still remember." She folded her hands. Then the apples did their duty. His mouth moved at one corner, almost a smile. Ethan returned with brown paper parcels, set them under the seat, and placed a small sack of coffee beside the cup without comment. That was the first thing Clara did not know how to answer. Not because it was large, because it was exact. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the dull pewter color that meant rain before supper. Ethan pulled the wagon into the yard of the Cole place, a low cabin with a barn behind it, 2 corrals, and a woodpile stacked straight against the east wall. Nothing fancy, nothing careless. Ben jumped down, and carried the sewing basket inside before Clara could protest. Ethan took the trunk to the porch and stopped with one hand on the latch. "Kitchen is warm," he said. "You can wait out the rain." Clara looked at the road back to town. It had already begun to darken with wet. She stepped inside. The cabin smelled of coffee, saddle leather, wood smoke, and beans kept low on the stove. There were 2 chairs at the table and a third with a cracked rung, pushed against the wall as if no one used it unless company required. Ben set her basket on that chair. Ethan noticed the cracked rung. He pulled the chair out, turned it once, and carried it to the workbench. No explanation. Just work. Clara stood near the door with her gloves still on while he fitted a clamp, chose a shaving of pine, and began making the chair sound enough to hold her. The rain reached the cabin before dark and settled in with a steady sound on the roof. Ethan worked on the chair while Ben laid plates on the table, one for his uncle, one for himself, and then stood with the third plate in his hand. Clara saw the question before he asked it. Ethan saw it too. He did not look up from the clamp. "Set it down," he said. Ben placed the plate at the side of the table where the repaired chair would go, careful and pleased, as if the table had been waiting to be even. Clara took off her gloves then. She folded them once and set them beside her sewing basket. That small surrender made the room quieter. While Ethan shaved the pine smooth, Clara moved to the stove and lifted the pot lid. Beans, onions, a little salt pork. Enough, but tired from long keeping. She looked once toward Ethan. He gave a slight nod, not permission exactly, more like trust offered in a plain wooden bowl. She washed her hands, found flour, and made a quick skillet bread without asking where every tool belonged. Ben watched from the table. "Mrs. Larkin said you had no kin," he said. Clara pressed the dough flat with the heel of her hand. "Mrs. Larkin says many things before noon." Ben considered that. "Do you?" The rain filled the pause. Clara dusted flour from her fingers. "Not close enough to come for me." Ethan's knife stopped only a moment, then went on. He did not turn her answer into pity. He only set the chair upright, tested the rung with his weight, and carried it to the table. The skillet bread browned clean at the edges. Clara cut it into thirds, then into fourths when she saw Ben watching the pan. Ethan poured coffee into the tin cup from the wagon and set it by her plate. Not in front of her like a guest. Beside the plate, where a person eating supper would reach for it. Ben noticed first. His eyes moved from the cup to Clara's face. He said nothing, but his shoulders settled. That was how the first evening changed. Not with a promise. With a chair that held, bread divided fairly, and a coffee cup placed close enough to belong to her if she chose to lift it. Morning came with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Clara woke in the chair by the stove with her shawl still pinned and her sewing basket tucked beneath her hand. Sometime before dawn, Ethan had built the fire up again without waking her. A folded blanket lay across the table within reach. Not over her shoulders. Not placed in a way that would make her feel handled. Just close enough to take. Ben came in from the yard carrying eggs in his hat and stopped when he saw her awake. "You did not leave," he said. Clara sat straighter and smoothed her skirt. The road was poor. Ben nodded as if that explained everything a boy needed explained. Ethan came through the back door with rain on his coat and a pail of milk in one hand. He set it down, poured coffee, and put the tin cup beside the repaired chair before he took any for himself. Clara watched the cup a moment, then stood. She folded the blanket, laid it neatly over the chair back, and went to the wash basin. There was work in the room, and work was easier than gratitude. She found the bread cloth from supper, shook out the crumbs for the hens, washed the skillet, and mended a tear in Ben's coat cuff while the eggs cooked. Ben sat close, pretending not to watch her needle. "That stitch holds better than Ma's used to," he said, then went very still. Ethan looked at him, not sharply, just enough. Clara tied off the thread and did not ask after the woman missing from the room. She only turned the cuff and checked the seam with her thumb. "It should last through winter if you do not use fences as ladders." Ben's face eased. After breakfast, Ethan carried Clara's trunk from the porch into the cabin. He did not put it in the main room. He took it to the little lean-to chamber off the kitchen, the one with a narrow cot, a peg rail, and a small square window looking toward the east field. The room smelled of cedar shavings and stored quilts. Plain, clean, empty enough to not feel like stealing someone else's place. Ethan set the trunk inside the door and stepped back. "Roof does not leak," he said. "Latch holds. You can stay until you have another arrangement." Clara stood on the threshold with her sewing basket against her hip. Ben had followed only as far as the kitchen. He knew, before either adult said it, that this was not just shelter from rain. It was the first door in town that had opened without asking her to prove she deserved it. Clara looked at the cot, the peg rail, the window, then at Ethan's hands hanging quiet at his sides. She did not thank him right away. She set her sewing basket on the cot first. Then she turned the coffee cup in her fingers, the one he had filled again before bringing her there. "I can mend, cook, keep accounts, and teach Ben in the evenings," she said. Ethan nodded once. "That will do." It was not romance. It was terms. It was work before warmth. But when Clara stepped inside the little room and closed her hand around the latch, it held. The first week found its shape before anyone named it. Ethan left before sunup with the horses, and Clara rose when the stove ticked low, added split wood, and put coffee on before Ben came in rubbing sleep from his eyes. She did not take over the house. She learned it. The flour crock beside the stove, the salt in the blue jar, the loose hinge on the pantry door, the place where Ethan kept nails in an old tobacco tin. By Wednesday, Ben's sums were laid out beside his breakfast plate, and by Thursday, his copybook looked less like a storm had crossed it. Clara marked nothing in red. She circled what was right. Ben worked harder after that. Ethan noticed. He noticed the mended cuff that did not fray, the accounts copied clean on brown paper, the beans sorted before supper, and the way Ben no longer rushed through chores to escape his lessons. He said little. He brought in more lamp oil without being asked. He fixed the draft under her little room window. He set a second peg beside the door for her shawl. Each thing was small enough to deny and useful enough to matter. Every morning, the tin coffee cup waited by her chair. Not filled until she came in. Never pushed toward her. Waiting. Clara began to reach for it without looking. That was the part that troubled her most. So she worked harder. She baked cornbread with a better crumb, stitched Ethan's torn work glove across the palm, and showed Ben how to carry numbers by using dry beans lined in rows. On Friday evening, rain threatened again. Ethan came in late with mud on his boots and a broken bridle strap in his hand. Clara took one look at the leather and reached for her sewing basket. "Harness thread is in the bottom," she said. Ben looked up from his slate. "You mend leather too?" Clara opened the basket and removed a folded cloth, needles, beeswax, and a small all-with-a worn handle. Enough to keep a thing useful. Ethan washed at the basin and came to the table. He watched her hands work the strap, steady and exact. Not pretty work. Strong work. When she finished, he tested the seam once, then again. "That will hold," he said. Clara lowered her eyes to the basket lid. The words had landed too cleanly. Ben saw it before Ethan did. He saw how she closed the basket fast, as if praise might spill something open. Later, after supper, Ben brought his reader to the table and asked for the story with the lost colt. Clara sat beside him and helped him sound out the hard words. Ethan stayed near the stove, mending a trace chain that did not need mending that long. The room settled around the three of them. Coffee, lamplight, a boy leaning toward a page, a man pretending not to listen, a woman teaching because her hands knew where to go when her life did not. When Ben finally slept, Clara gathered the cups. Ethan took them from her and carried them to the basin himself. "You have done enough today," he said. She stood with the dish towel in both hands. Outside, the wind moved along the cabin wall. Inside, the second peg held her shawl. Her sewing basket sat on the chair Ben now called hers. And for the first time since the schoolhouse door closed, Clara left something on the table overnight. Her thimble beside the tin coffee cup, small and silver in the lamplight, as if some part of her expected to return in the morning. By the second week, the coal cabin no longer sounded the same in the mornings. It had the old sounds still, Ethan's boots before dawn, the stove door opening, the horses shifting in the yard, Ben dragging one heel when he came in half awake. But there were new sounds now. Clara shaking flour into a bowl, her pencil moving across Ben's slate, the soft click of her thimble when she set it beside the tin coffee cup before breakfast. Nothing announced itself. It simply stayed long enough to become expected. On Monday, Ben read 3 pages without guessing at the long words. Clara did not praise him loudly. She put one dried apple slice beside his plate. On Tuesday, he split kindling without being told because she had written the chore list in clear letters and pinned it by the door. On Wednesday, Ethan found the ranch accounts balanced, with the feed costs separated from the household costs, and a neat column showing what could be saved if he bought oats before the winter price rose. He stood at the table a long while with the paper in his hand. Clara was turning shirt collars by the window, her sewing basket open at her feet. "This is useful," he said. She kept her eyes on the seam. It was untidy. He looked at the columns again. "It is useful," he said, and left the paper where she could see he had kept it. That afternoon, Mrs. Larkin came by with a covered dish and a face arranged for concern. She looked at Clara's shawl on the second peg, the mended chair at the table, the tin coffee cup washed, and set near Clara's place. "I wondered how you were getting on," she said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "There is work enough." Mrs. Larkin glanced toward Ethan, expecting him to explain what Clara was doing there. Ethan was repairing a saddle buckle by the hearth. He did not look up. "Miss Whitmore teaches Ben," he said. "Keeps accounts. Helps with the house." The words were plain. They were also offense. Mrs. Larkin heard it. Ben heard it better. After she left, he stood at the window until her wagon disappeared down the road. "She did not ask if you had a room," he said. Clara folded the dish towel once. "No," Ben turned. "You do." Clara looked toward the lean-to chamber, where her trunk sat under the east window, and her spare dress hung from the peg Ethan had added. That evening, Ben brought out an old primer from a drawer beneath the bed. It had belonged to his mother. The cover was softened from use, the corners rubbed pale. He set it in front of Clara, then sat down hard, as if courage had weight. "Can we use this one?" Clara touched the cover with 2 fingers. Ethan went still by the stove. The fire shifted. No one filled the room too quickly. Clara opened the book to the first lesson and found a pressed violet between the pages, dry and nearly colorless. She did not remove it. She turned the page carefully and began where the old hand had stopped. Ben leaned close. Ethan stayed with his coffee untouched, watching the two of them from the far side of the table. Not smiling, not speaking. But when Clara reached for the tin cup, he had already warmed it again. The letter came on Thursday, folded once and sealed with the school board stamp. Clara found it on the porch rail beside the milk pail, where the rider had left it while Ethan and Ben were in the far pasture. She wiped her hands before opening it. That was the first thing. Even bad news, she believed, deserved clean hands. The board had reconsidered. Not her place at the schoolhouse. Not the room behind it. Only a temporary post with the church school 3 miles south, until the minister's niece could travel after Christmas. Wages were low. Board was not included. She read it twice, then set it beneath the tin coffee cup so the wind would not take it. For the rest of the morning, she worked as she always did. Bread into the oven. Ash swept clean. Ben's lesson copied in a steady hand. Ethan's accounts updated with the price of oats. Nothing in the cabin changed because of a paper. That was what Clara told herself. Near noon, Ben came in with burrs on his trouser cuffs and found the letter. He was old enough to read the important parts and young enough to let his face show all of them. He looked at Clara's trunk in the little room, then at the second peg with her shawl, then at the coffee cup holding the corner of the page. "Are you going?" Clara took the bread from the oven and set it on the board. She did not answer while the knife was in her hand. "It is work," she said at last. Ben looked down. "You have work here." The words came out too small for what they carried. Clara laid the knife aside. Outside, a calf bawled from the lower pen. Ethan was not back yet. The latch on the back gate had been sticking since rain swelled the wood, and Ben had been told not to force it. He went anyway, quick and angry in the way children move when they do not know where to put fear. Clara saw him from the window. She was outside before. He reached the gate, her skirt gathered in one hand, her work shoes darkening in the mud. She did not scold him. She set her shoulder to the post, lifted the latch clean, and showed him how to ease the swollen wood back without breaking it. Then she stayed. She helped him spread hay. She checked the water trough. She tied up the loose strip of fence Ethan had meant to mend before dusk. When Ethan rode in, he found Clara in the yard with mud on her hem, Ben beside her, and the school board letter still pinned under the cup on the table inside. He looked from the repaired gate to the fence, then to the boy, whose eyes were red but dry. Clara brushed straw from her sleeve. "The calf would not settle," she said. Ethan dismounted slowly. He understood what the work said before he read the letter. She had been offered a way out. Instead, she had put her hands on the place that needed holding. That evening, Clara packed nothing. She washed the supper dishes, set Ben's primer by his plate for morning, and left her thimble beside the tin coffee cup again. Ethan stood at the doorway of the little room after the lamps were turned low. He had the school board letter in his hand, folded along its old crease. He did not ask her to stay. Not then. Trust had brought her this far, and he would not turn it into a cage. He only set the letter on the shelf beside her sewing basket and placed a small brass key next to it. "Front door sticks in the cold," he said. "Key is yours if you need it." Clara looked at the key, then at the coffee cup still waiting on the table. In the quiet, Ben rolled over in his sleep and murmured the first word from his mother's old primer. On Friday morning, Ethan hitched the wagon before breakfast and set Clara's trunk back from the door where no one passing the yard could mistake it for leaving. He laid the school board letter on the seat beside him and waited until Clara came out with Ben's primer in one hand and the tin coffee cup in the other. She had washed it, dried it, and turned it once in her fingers before stepping onto the porch. Ethan noticed. He did not ask for it. He only held out his hand. Clara gave him the letter instead. The ride into town was quiet. Ben sat between them with his slate on his knees, not working a single sum. At the church school, the board had gathered early, coats buttoned, hats in hand, already arranging their faces for proper words. Mayor Thomas Reed stood near the steps with Mrs. Larkin and the minister, speaking in low tones that stopped when the coal wagon rolled up. Clara did not climb down right away. Ethan did. He took off his hat, walked to the steps, and handed Mayor Reed the folded letter. "Miss Whitmore will not be taking the temporary post," he said. The mayor looked past him toward the wagon. "That is her decision to give." Ethan nodded. "It is. I brought it so you could hear it plain." Clara stepped down then, because he had not spoken over her, only made room for her voice to stand without being crowded. Ben held the coffee cup against his chest like something breakable. Clara smoothed her gloves, looked at the men who had closed her school without asking where she would sleep, and gave the answer herself. "I have work at the coal place." Mrs. Larkin's eyes moved too quickly. "Housework." Clara looked at Ben. "Teaching. Accounts. Mending what can still be mended." Ethan turned toward the wagon, lifted a wrapped bundle from beneath the seat, and set it on the church steps. Inside were 6 copybooks, 3 primers, and a neat account page showing the cost of schooling Ben and any child who could ride out twice a week. He had bought the books at the mercantile before the meeting. He had paid in cash. Mayor Reed picked up the account page and grew still. Practical things quieted powerful men faster than speeches. "You intend to open lessons at your ranch?" he asked. Ethan looked once at Clara. "Miss Whitmore does." "Not he. Not the town. Clara." The choice rested where it belonged. Ben finally climbed down and set the tin coffee cup on top of the copybooks, where everyone could see the faint mark her hand had worn warm around the rim. It looked out of place on the church steps. It looked exactly right. Clara touched the cup, then the books. Her name was not on the schoolhouse door anymore. But Ethan had brought her work into town and stood beside it until others had to see it too. By the time they reached the coal place, the afternoon light had settled soft across the yard. Ben jumped down first and carried the copybooks inside as if they were eggs. Clara followed with the primers against her chest. Ethan brought the tin coffee cup last. He washed it at the basin, dried it with the corner of the dish towel, and set it beside her place at the table. Not near the edge anymore. Not where a guest might sit. Beside his own cup, with Ben's smaller mug across from them. Clara stood in the doorway with her gloves still on. The house had not changed while they were gone, but it looked different to her now. The second peg held her shawl. Her thimble waited by the lamp. Her sewing basket sat under the window, open to the afternoon, blue thread shining across the lid. Ben spread his slate on the table and wrote his name straighter than he ever had before. Then he paused, looked at Clara, and added Coal Ranch School beneath it in careful letters. Ethan saw it. Clara saw it. No one corrected him. Supper was simple. Beans, skillet bread, coffee, and the last of the dried apples. Clara cut the bread while Ethan filled the cups. Ben read aloud after the dishes were cleared, stumbling only once, and Clara let him find the word himself. Ethan mended a bridle strap by the stove, but his hand slowed whenever Ben's voice steadied. When the lamp burned low, Clara rose to take her sewing basket to the little room. Ethan reached up and set a new nail beside the shelf, high enough to keep the basket safe, low enough for her hand. He had measured it right. She hung it there, then stood a moment with her fingers resting on the handle. In the morning, children would ride out for lessons. Work would need doing. Coffee would need pouring. Nothing had been promised in grand words. But when Clara came back to the table, Ethan had left her cup filled and waiting beside his, and Ben had fallen asleep with his primer open between them, one hand resting on the page as if he had been holding the place for her all along.